hang on a minute, guys, in the administration, what are you saying about bringing your firearm to a protest?
The difference between an ICE officer and a Border Patrol officer, it's a uniform difference in a lot of cases.
We have not seen this before, this criticism from the right, and this bipartisan criticism on this.
Here we are, another week, another episode of The President's Path, and Brendan and I are delighted to say that we have a guest star with us this week, Finn Gomez, the political director and executive director of White House coverage at CBS News, our next door neighbours here in Washington, D.C., and our very good friend. So welcome, Finn. Great to have you with us.
Yeah, I'm so great. I'm so grateful to be back on. It's my favorite podcast, as I've said many times.
A long-time friend of TPP.
And if you keep saying those nice things, we'll keep asking you back on as well.
Even better.
Who doesn't love flattery, especially when it's so cold and icy and we're all digging out our driveways and our footpaths here in Washington, D.C. Colder and more icier, though, in more ways than one in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota for the last 2 months now. We've been talking on the pod about foreign affairs and international relations for the last few weeks, but we've reached really another tipping point. So I think we should take a step back and have a look at the situation in Minneapolis. Lots of developments on that this week. And of course, since we were last speaking, a second person has been shot and killed by federal agents in Minneapolis, that being Alex Pretty. And of course, Renee Good was shot and killed just at the start of January. It really felt like with Alex Pretty's killing that this shifted things a little bit, shifted the focus, shifted the conversation, whatever about in Minneapolis, but in the White House as well.
And I also think that the White House something that isn't very characteristic for them is that they were caught kind of on the back foot this time. Caroline Leavitt's briefing at the White House the Monday following the shooting, the tone of it was really quite different than previous briefings that had focused on ICE detentions and immigration. And, you could see kind of the narratives start to split a little bit from over the weekend, Stephen Miller saying that Mr. Pretty had been an assassin, to the White House kind of counseling everyone to wait for an investigation to take place. And I think that's something you haven't seen very often in the last year, that, that sort of different messaging coming from different parts of the White House. I think it was quite unique in that regard.
Yeah, I agree, and especially on, also what we did see after the initial incident occurred in Minneapolis over the weekend. The language, not just not just what Stephen Miller said, but also we heard it from Secretary Noem, the DHS secretary, and others just saying, Bovino, saying that, that Pretty was intent to massacre. Like, that term massacre came out very quickly from the DHS press office, and we heard it from those two. And I think when you hear that, it immediately gives a connotation of something that what many people what we saw was not what occurred, at least in the video that we saw, that it wasn't that. And by all accounts, he didn't brandish his weapon, as was also suggested, and they had to go back and take a step back and, like you said, walk that back. Even Bernie, to your point, during that White House press briefing, Caroline Leavitt, she would not go there when asked specifically about that language about massacre. She said that the president did not use that term or something along those lines, right, Bernie? It was really, I think, a really notable moment in this administration, especially over that.
And nor did President Trump, kind of, when he was asked about the actual shooting a few days later, he didn't say, he didn't absolve the officers involved from any responsibility. He didn't really answer the question of whether he thinks they were right or wrong to discharge their weapons in that particular moment. So I thought that was, pretty reserved by the standards of this White House, also in terms of, holding back on passing judgment when asked by a reporter about it.
Then you had Stephen Miller, though, a few days later saying something along the lines of maybe correct protocol wasn't followed here and there's an investigation, which was a really significant departure from, as you were saying, Finn, what we were hearing over the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in part, like this is, I covered all of the first Trump term, all 4 years. And I can think of maybe one time that there was even that they issued an apology, right? And this is the closest we've gotten. And it wasn't an apology. I'm not saying it's that at all, but it's the closest we've seen to that, right? And where they have sort of acknowledged, frankly, a misstatement, a mistake, a incongruity in terms of different parts of the administration when it comes to that language, and when it occurred in Minneapolis last weekend. So again, it was very notable, and I do think, and we have heard that the president and other of the senior advisors have looked at some of the polling that has come out, right, and shows that is the issue that helped him win in 2024. One of them, along with affordability, was his his hardline perspective and policies on immigration, and now we've seen there's been a negative impact to those poll numbers. Even there's a new Fox News poll out today, and I want to get this right, but 59% in this Fox News poll say that ICE is acting, quote, too aggressive, and 55% of voters disapprove of how immigration is being handled. That's notable, especially coming from Fox.
I think that that's kind of reflected in the course correction, if you want to call it that took place in Minneapolis when the White House ordered that the border czar Tom Homan come and take over on the ground enforcement, be the lead for on the ground enforcement rather than Greg Bovino, because Tom Homan is someone who's been very much focused on a slightly more targeted approach against undocumented immigrants with criminal histories aside from the violation of immigration law. And I think that's something that a lot of the president's supporters that are concerned about ICE enforcement, they'll be quite happy with that. I think you look at some of those poll numbers and it shows that a lot of people they're still very supportive of the overarching goal of what President Trump promised immigration wise in the campaign, but the way it's been carried out is causing a lot of people to become very uncomfortable. And that's something I hear quite a lot from voters, particularly Latino Republican voters who that's something they expected criminals to be detained, not the grandmother down the street or someone they've known for 40 years who's not a public safety hazard.
And that's a really interesting thing that we do see in those polls, like that Fox one you're talking about, Finn. But there were a couple over the weekend as well. I think there was one from YouGov where people were polled before Alex Pretty was shot, and it was still in and around the same, like 57% or so of people disapproved or strongly disapproved of the tactics being used by ICE. And I suppose we should say, when we say ICE, we're talking about Immigration Customs Enforcement, that agency, but also it's kind of become a catch-all term for the Border Patrol agents who are on the ground in Minneapolis as well. They are two agencies under the Department of Homeland Security. And I think we've seen some people as well try and distinguish the two, listening to some of the experts in this field that we've had on our shows this week, saying that the ICE guys are used to an urban environment where they're enforcing immigration law, where they have detention orders from a court. They have to go and seek a person out and deport them. And there's nothing unusual in that, we should say. That's not something that President Trump has just started doing. That the highest number of deportations, in fact, were under President Obama in recent years. But the Border Patrol agents are different. They're used to a different environment. They're used to working in a very dangerous environment, a heavily armed environment, dealing with gangs, cartels, the coyotes along the border there, where, I've spent time down there. We all have, there are very violent and scary situations with vulnerable people taking their lives into their hands, paying very bad people a lot of money to get them across the Rio Grande. And so they have a different set of skills. And it's been really interesting, I think, to see that debate about the skills and the tactics being used, because, as you've both said, there is a broad support for the fact that if there are criminals, bad people in this country, by and large, Americans of all persuasions do want them removed, don't they?
I think also that's perhaps why the White House has now taken Tom Homan to take the lead in Minneapolis, because he has, much of his career was in what they call ERO, enforcement and removal operations.
Well, he's a former Border Patrol agent as well himself. way back
Yeah,
when.
but much of his career has been kind of on that sort of domestic enforcement that is much more targeted, where and across administrations, Democrats and Republicans, and I think he's kind of seen as someone who can bring that to the table and perhaps get along better with state and local officials, as opposed to Bovino, who has generally taken a pretty combative tone, even after the shooting took place in Minneapolis. You saw him snapping back at people on social media quite a bit. I think Homan is kind of the opposite of that. It was kind of a steady hand with a lot of experience in a slightly more subtle approach to immigration enforcement.
You're absolutely right. And one thing that the administration, as you know, has also been touting is that he got this distinction under the Obama administration back in 2016. So if you recall, there was the Obama administration did really double down on their efforts on deportations as well in that second term. Part of the reason, frankly, that President Obama won re-election in 2012. But so he is, and I think it was also something significant that the president said in that initial announcement on his Truth Social post when he announced Homan was going to take the place of Bovino, that he was going to answer directly to him. So that there's no question there. It's not to Noam, it's not to Miller, it's to the president. And I think that also was sort of an indicator that perhaps it might be there's it's not all it's not all perfect. Maybe there's some differing lines of communication, and also that maybe there's been a lot of talk this week also about the future of Noam and where she will stand in this administration. Of course, the president was asked about this before he went to Iowa earlier this week, and he said she wasn't going anywhere. But sort of the MO, now covering President Trump, I've covered him since 2011, actually, going back, guys, when he was flirting with maybe running in that cycle.
But you look so young, Finn. You were a cub reporter,
but I was 14.
School newspaper.
But if you call it, the sort of MO with President Trump is like you never apologize. Like if you apologize, it's an acknowledgement of a mistake. So you don't apologize, and even if there was an error or something, it's never public facing. But if you recall, Mike Waltz, we all know the former head of the NSC, the National Security Council, who was sort of defenestrated, promoted out, if you will, following that Signal Gate fiasco. Same thing. It didn't happen. Circled the wagons. He's doing great. And then a couple months later, he's out. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Noam, but that is a pattern that we've seen before. And she has been heavily criticized, including by Republicans this week, which to me indicates that it might get worse.
The counter argument is Pete Hegseth, and he's still there, and he's brought a lot of grief on the president's doorstep as well, including Signalgate, and from there on, and he's still standing. So you just can never really know with this president. And I mean, in political circles in many other countries, sometimes leaders express votes of confidence in their lieutenants, and within hours the knife is in the back and they're gone out of the cabinet room. So who knows? But I think the other point about her and Stephen Miller as well were these comments they made, as did Kash Patel, the FBI director, that Alex Pretty was carrying a gun, that he brought a gun to a protest. And we heard the president say that in the middle of the week as well. And that so somehow by having a gun at the protest, he deserved what came to him, when actually he had a legally held firearm and he was using it or had it about his person in concealed carry, which is the law of Minnesota. So there was no issue with anything to do with him and his firearm. And it was remarkable, like hearing from the NRA, Gun Owners Association, kind of saying, hang on a minute, guys, in the administration, what are you saying about bringing your firearm to a protest or walking along a street with a firearm? He was within his rights, and we all do that. And, I think that led a bit to some of the president's change in tone, and some of the pushback from Republicans as well was, hang on, are you actually questioning our Second Amendment rights, which are so fundamental to so much of what we all stand for?
I do think that's kind of what made this incident incident materially different in terms of the reaction from the White House, as you know, there's been protests against ICE operations all over the country for the entire year that he's been back in Los Angeles and Chicago and other cities. And this one was quite different because it led to a backlash on both sides of the political spectrum, which we really hadn't seen before. That sort of kind of open criticism from people who are frankly very supportive of this administration, the gun lobby and the NRA being a good example. I think it crossed a line in terms of perception on the right that the previous incident or even the previous shooting in Minnesota earlier this year that just hadn't before.
And also, I mean, if you go back to 2020, if you'll recall, little Kyle Rittenhouse. Now, he was the 17-year-old who shot three men, and sort of became a cause celeb, if you will, on the right because of that. And so, there's a contrast there. And you're right, Katrina. I mean, the fact that the NRA came out and said and essentially pushed back on that notion was extremely telling. I mean, like it is a fundamental, crucial part of the Republican platform. It has been for decades. And I think that it was very notable that we have in this second Trump term, we have not been here yet. We have not seen this before, where we are seeing this criticism from the right and this bipartisan criticism on this, and so that to me it's telling and it's notable that we're in a different place than we have been so far.
And we are in a different place, but if we look at what's happening on the streets of Minneapolis, even with the arrival of Tom Homan, and he spoke to the media in that press conference early on Thursday morning, still no indication that things are going to change on the ground. He had a kind of vague acknowledgement that things hadn't been going perfectly well and that he would look to sort of pull back some of the agents, but he didn't give any details on what that would look like or how many, or that any of the policies or the approaches would change either. So you kind of have to wonder, it feels in a way like a little bit of the heat has gone out of this, but has it really?
The thing about Homan's approach is that he's been kind of remarkably consistent since Trump came back into the office, that even with these targeted operations, any and all undocumented people found during these operations are on the table. So I recently speaking to a lot of people that work with undocumented migrants, immigration advocates, for example, and they kind of scoffed at any sort of suggestion that Homan is some sort of moderate, even compared to Bovino. I mean, Homan, in that space, he has a reputation as someone who was such a defender of family separations in Trump's first term. I think a lot of people working in that space think that Homan will be just kind of more of the same, but perhaps just more PR friendly for the administration than Bovino was.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I will say that Homan in that press conference, Katrina, that you're referring to, he also, I mean, he's also met with Governor Walz, right? He's spoken to Mayor Frey, the Minneapolis mayor, obviously, he's been at the forefront and sort of the criticism towards the administration from the local level, really become a nationalized voice. So there could be a different tenor that we're seeing. But to your point, Bernie, it's kind of a wait and see approach, right? Like, will it change? It's still early days in this new Homan chapter. Will it tamper down, what's happening in Minneapolis?
I think it needs to be said also that for a lot of folks in Minneapolis or in other American cities, the difference between an ICE officer and a Border Patrol officer, if you actually see them on the street, I mean, it's a uniform difference in a lot of cases, and the reaction is still going to be the same if they feel that those officers are doing something wrong. So I think, there's a lot of room for error and still for misunderstandings if something isn't addressed quite quickly.
And fundamentally, Minneapolis and other cities will remain sanctuary cities. Even throughout this week, we heard Mayor Jacob Frey saying over and over, we will not facilitate the enforcement of these immigration policies, which is their right constitutionally. And this is where we've seen these clashes over the past year in so many other cities, isn't it? That the immigration law of the land, the federal law, is the law, and it's up to ICE agents and others to enforce that. But they can't I suppose to explain it, as the local or state level officials don't have to help them enforce it. And that's where we're seeing this clash come up. And the administration says the Minneapolis PD in this case should be helping the ICE agents to round up these people. And things have changed. As we know, they can go door to door now without a serious level of a warrant and so on. And I think as long as we see Minneapolis and other cities saying, no, we're not helping you with that you're going to continue to see these clashes, because the policies aren't going to change from this administration. We even heard the president talking about that in the cabinet meeting on Thursday and lauding how he's, really squashed the numbers of people coming over the border. So I don't know how this gets resolved really without being too doomsday about it, when there is such a fundamental clash of beliefs as to what is right and wrong.
And like you said, I think DHS and the White House repeatedly make the argument that these sanctuary cities, by not cooperating, for example, by letting ICE agents into detention facilities, they're in fact endangering the public by forcing those enforcement actions out onto the street rather than inside, jails, for example. So I think, that debate doesn't go away really, no matter what happens in Minneapolis, because there's other cities that are still, you know, going to be doing that, even if Minneapolis somehow changes policies.
And I have to say, all this has an effect. And I know, Bernie, you alluded to this earlier, and Katrina too, is that we are approximately about a month away until the first midterm primaries. Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina. Texas especially, it has a really big Senate race happening there. We have seen polling show that Latino voters, Hispanic voters, who are a big part of the Trump 2024 coalition, that their support has cratered. That it, and going into this cycle, this will be, and it's starting to be, a major political issue on the campaign trail as well. And for some Republicans, there is a skittishness of how this will impact their chances of reelection, or their chances to hold on to their majority in the House. It's a very slim majority that Speaker Johnson has, of course. And even now, there's some talk about Democrats overperforming in the Senate as well. And yes, affordability, we've heard it ad nauseum. That is the major issue. It is a major issue for most Americans. The economy, cost of things, we know that. But this issue is starting to rise, and it could significantly impede the chances for Republicans, I think. And I think the White House knows that, and I think I think Republican national organizations know that. They have to do something, I believe, politically. They have to do something, and I think that's part of the reason that we saw this reaction over the events that unfolded in Minneapolis last weekend, and what we talked about earlier. I do think that they see it as a major obstacle for them politically, and they have to change the narrative. And right now, speaking to Democrats and Democratic organizations, I spoke to a Democratic challenger, Brian Varela, in New Jersey. He's running in that race, who said that he's using this issue in particular to rise and perform well in that primary race. So when you're seeing that in places like New Jersey, and his district, it's, I think, 13% Latino. It's not this large number. I think it's going to resonate, and it's going to resonate in places that we don't expect. With independents as well, we're seeing that slippage of support for the president. Another part of his Trump 2024 coalition, and he's not going to be on a ballot this time. So it does seem that if they don't get their arms wrapped around this situation, that it could be they could be looking at a tough November.
We'll have to do another episode, I think, on those primaries, particularly Texas and Illinois coming fast up, because they are going to be really interesting about the issues and the candidates as well, aren't they? But we're out of time for this week. Finn, great to have had you with us, guest starring for this week. Hopefully we will get to talk to you again soon.
Always a pleasure, Finn. It's been great.
I love it, Katrina. Thank you.
And stay warm out there, guys. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.